Today we're going to finish up our notes on Darwin's theories of evolution and natural selection, and we're going to begin by taking a virtual visit to the Galapagos Islands. I just want you to look at these images for a minute. There are 10 islands in the chain, and Charles Darwin was a naturalist, and means he what we would probably call a biologist today or an environmental scientist. He loved outdoors and nature, and he spent time on a ship called the Beagle, and the Beagle traveled to the Galapagos Islands. There was 18 months he spent at sea, and it was a total of a 5-year journey, 18 months on the boat, and then obviously about 2.5, 3 years on the islands. He brought back detailed drawings and journals of what he had seen and life of the history and geology of South America. He also visited Tahiti in Australia in that time as well. He also brought back some of the animals themselves and the shells themselves, and he spent 8 years just studying the barnacles alone that he observed there. He spent many years studying finches and their beaks. He thought when his sketches they were all different birds, but when he came back to England and took his rough sketches to a bird artist, the bird artist let him know that they were really all finches. They were just different species of the finch, and he pointed that out, and that led Darwin's natural curiosity to be able to help him writing his theories. And this was a long process. He spent 5 years on this journey around the world exploring and collecting information and journal and drawings, and then he spent 20 years writing his theory before it was published. So as you can see, the Galapagos are beautiful and exotic places. Darwin's idea of natural selection is really this idea of survival of the fittest and differentiated reproduction. That there are genes that are passed down, and the most favorable gene is the one that is going to be continued to pass down in reproduction. Species that can reproduce and pass down the most successful genes are the ones that are going to survive. It is the driving force behind evolution, this idea that life changes over time, because if you do not adapt to your environment as it changes, you're not going to make it. That's what we call extinction. So for an example, if you are an animal with white fur, like the polar bear, you're going to have a survival advantage if you live in Alaska or the northern parts of Canada. You're going to be much less likely to be seen or noticed by prey, so you have a hunting advantage. So you are more successful in your environment. You're able to outcompete some of your competitors for food because of this natural camouflage that you have. Now, imagine this. All bears probably did not start out with white fur. In fact, living in the forest, white fur would have made them very vulnerable. So if they were living in forest, they would have been brown or black furred, and they would have been the ones that would have been most successful in their ecosystem. But as time changed, some of the bears migrated north, and as they migrated to the less forested, snowy plains of the northern poles, the ones that had the white fur then became the ones who were more successful in hunting and able to get more food. The white fur did not show up. It reflected light, as did the snow. So survival of the fittest would tell us that the bears that migrated north, the gene for white fur was the most successful gene. The bears that stayed in the forest, the brown and the black fur would have been the most successful gene. And so that natural selection is dependent on mutations in the genetic code. And last year when you studied, you should know that there are dominant and recessive genes, and that there can be gene mutations, and some mutations are helpful, some mutations can be harmful and cause illness. In this case, the desirable gene, what became the polar bear species, was a successful adaptation. Now, the second part of Darwin's theory is the theory of evolution, and he believed, even though he struggled with how the conflict in his religious views and how the world would see it before publishing it, he said that different species all evolved from simpler life forms, and the simpler life forms would have developed more than 3.5 billion years ago, and bacteria is what the evidence shows as the first simplest life form. He says that evolution happens by natural selection, in that individuals in a species show a wide range of variation because of the difference in their genes, and the individuals that have characteristics most likely that are suited for their environment will survive and reproduce successfully, passing on these genes. Individuals who were less adapted to the environment are less likely to survive. They're less likely to reproduce. That means their genes are not going to get passed on to a next generation, and eventually they will die out. And so if the species does not evolve, then extinction is the option. And variation is caused by genes that are passed on to the next generation. Now, what is the evidence for Darwin's theories? Well, we've got the fossil record, and we've been looking about that for the past couple of weeks. If you think about your geologic timeline and the biological evidence, that would be the fossil record. The geographical distribution, Alfred Wegener with continental drift, showed that the coastlines of South America and Africa had not only similar fossils, but similar rock layers in similar orders to prove that the continents were once connected, and that explains for geographic diversity and distribution of fossils. Embryology, which would be the study of the embryos developing fetuses. And then comparative anatomy, we're going to look at comparative anatomy in just a minute. If you look at the back of your notes page, we're going to do some comparisons about how species' ancient ancestors have similar characteristics to the modern day example. And then looking at the molecular and genetic, actually looking at the DNA and these genetic mutations that we find. So, focusing on this idea of comparative anatomy, you've got homologous structures, which means there is something that is alike in the way they are. So if you look at the human arm bone, the cat, the whale, and the bat, there are similar characteristics. You can see that they have the lower bone is made of two parts. There's an upper bone. So you're looking at these structures that are similar. And all of these are mammals. Here we have the fossil record showing how the giraffe has evolved over time. The ancient ancestor would have had a much shorter neck. At least the fossil record shows us that. But to get food and be a successful eater, had to be able to reach higher and higher for food, and so over time the longer neck became the dominant gene that got passed on. The giraffes that had the longer neck could reproduce for multiple generations, so that gene is the one that got passed on, and then over time the giraffe's neck became longer. So it was driven by this need to find food. Then we have horse evolution. So we've got the horse down at the bottom would be the oldest, had 4 toes, had short teeth, ate shrubs, soft leaves, trees, needed a different type of tooth than the one who has to eat very rough hay, which is a dry grass. It's almost got silica in it. It's almost a glass-like structure, so it's really tough. The hooves evolved as well. So over time, you can see that the ancestors changed, and the desirable gene got passed on. Here is a comparative anatomy of the elephant, and you can see we've mentioned the woolly mammoth, and you've got the ancient, so the modern day elephant would be the small one in gray, smaller one in gray. All right, now I want you to finish up your notes, and then we are going to finish up your changeover time packet. And if you finish that, I've got another activity for you to do.